Good morning from Glasgow. Today we're interviewing Robert Walker, the president of the Population Institute in Washington, D.C. Bob has produced a very good democratic vulnerability report, which is essential reading for everyone, especially in corporate undertakings who have interests throughout the world. This report is truly a fundamental change document without any doubt. So, Bob, welcome to the FNL Vienna meeting. We're delighted to have the chance to talk to you, and we hope we might see you in Europe soon. But first of all, what does the Population Institute do? I think everyone wants to know that, because a lot of people here don't.
Population Institute is based in Washington, D.C. We were created in 1969. We're a public education and advocacy group educating policymakers, the media, and the general public about population trends and their implications, but also about the benefits of family planning and reproductive health programs around the world.
Now, the key elements of that policy, presumably policy guidance, would, I suppose, come under 5 or 6 categories. I mean, hunger, poverty, water scarcity would be one we'd like to talk about, environmental degradation, political instability.
Well, let's start with the demographic transition. The world has been undergoing a demographic transition now over the past century, from essentially high mortality and high fertility to one of low mortality and low fertility. And that transition is well underway in most parts of the world. But what's happening is that in some parts of the world, while mortality rates have dropped, fertility rates remain very high. Let me give you an example of Niger, which I think really sort of capsulizes the population challenge, if I can put it that way. In 1950, women in Niger, in sub-Saharan Africa, had on average 7 to 8 children, but most of them did not live to adulthood. But thanks to pharmaceutical breakthroughs, to vaccinations, to better health, children in Niger today have a very, very good chance of living to adulthood. But women in Niger still have on average 7 to 8 children. And what that means in terms of population is that Niger's population, which was 2.5 million in 1950, today is 20 million. And according to the latest UN population projections, its population will grow to 72 million by mid-century and to 200 million by the end of this century. So in the course of 150 years, Niger's population could grow from 2.5 million to 200 million, even with some continued decline in fertility rates. So that's a very significant challenge for all the reasons that we talked about earlier that you mentioned, including hunger and poverty.
One of the factors in your report, if population grows 2% per year, it doubles every 35 years. That's a pretty scary statistic.
It is, and in fact, that's what's happening in Africa today. Africa's population in the next really 34 years will double, and the population of sub-Saharan Africa will grow from about 950 million to about 2.1 billion, according to the latest population projections. So what we're seeing in many countries, and we're primarily talking about sub-Saharan Africa, although also parts of South Asia, where because fertility rates have not fallen as they have in other parts of the world, we're seeing very brisk population growth. And really in many of these countries, there's no end in sight to that projected population growth. In the case of Africa, for example, the current population of Africa is 1.2 billion. By the end of the century, the UN says the population of Africa could be 4 billion. Countries that go through their demographic transition earn economic benefits. Demographers and economists like to refer to this as the demographic dividend, which means as families, couples have smaller families, they derive certain economic benefits. Their children, first of all, are generally better educated, better nourished, better health, but also the families themselves prosper. And as those smaller families prosper, so do countries.
You comment in the report that in the aftermath of the Second World War, there was ultimately a demographic dividend in Europe.
Yes, in Europe and in many parts of the world, we've seen a demographic dividend. And in fact, there really is no advanced economy today that has achieved that status without going through the demographic transition to lower fertility rates. So what we're now facing is not just simply a question about access to contraception, which is still a challenge in many developing countries, but really this broader gender issue, which is really so critical. Unless we can do a better job of educating girls and empowering women, what we're going to see in these parts of the world is continued rapid population growth. And that has very significant implications. Most importantly, it has significant implications for the well-being of people in those countries.
Well, how do major corporations deal with this? I mean, you've got the issue of government itself, or the instrument of government, but you know, the big corporations that are present in our meeting in Vienna, Africa may not be one of their main markets. Some suggest that Africa is the next frontier. No question, that is, many people take that view. I mean, what should these companies, these body corporates be thinking about in this context? They could say it's Africa, it's not my problem. I don't think you would necessarily support such a view or an opinion.
Oh, clearly, I think it's a global challenge, and one that donor nations like the United States and, of course, the European Union ought to be participating in meeting this challenge. But although obviously our primary concern is the welfare of people in these developing countries, but clearly if these countries continue to wrestle with hunger and poverty and water scarcity and deforestation and even political instability and conflict, that has global implications. It certainly has implications in terms of the global refugee crisis. I know you have a speaker later in your conference speaking to the European migrant crisis, but there is also a larger global crisis. And let me explain that for a second. 2014 set a record for the number of refugees and internally displaced people in the world. 59.5 million. That was 8 million more than in 2013. We don't have final numbers yet for 2015, but that too was a record year. And what we're seeing is a continued increase year after year in the number of refugees and internally displaced persons in the world. Now, 85 to 90% of those refugees and internally displaced persons at the moment are in the developing world, meaning they're not leaving for Europe yet. But what's happening is that this crisis is really unfolding, and as you look to the future of these countries, where, as we talked about earlier, population growth may very well double, and in some cases, in some of these countries, demographers believe the population will actually triple in the next 35 years, then the global refugee problem could be much larger. And when I talk about the global refugee problem, I'm not talking simply about political refugees. I'm talking also about economic and environmental refugees. And this could be a very, very destabilizing force for the world. The second point I want to mention, because I know this is a corporate audience, is that there's a lot of hope that, you know, Africa will be the next great market, and we certainly all hope that. But as you look at economic growth in Africa, which has really slackened a great deal in the last couple of years as a result of the fall in commodity prices, what we're seeing is that the long-term growth trends for Africa are not that positive, that we may not see the kind of growth in the middle class that we've seen, for example, in many parts of Asia. So for companies that are thinking of Africa as the market of the future in terms of consumers, if these countries continue to wrestle with hunger and poverty on the scale that they do today, and potentially on a much larger scale as their population grows, then those markets may not materialize.
We also know that 1 million people from your report were suffering from water scarcity in Syria, which contributed to the conflict in Syria.
Absolutely.
So, and then we've got the problem, of course, in Yemen, which your report very lucidly states Sana'a, the capital, may run out of water by 2025 completely. So how are we going to deal with all these questions?
Right. Well, it's going to present a tremendous challenge to the world in the form of multiple humanitarian crises developing as a result of water scarcity and hunger and poverty. And no one knows how the world will respond. If you combine climate change, and many of these countries that we're talking about will likely suffer very severe effects from climate change, then what we have is a situation of where these countries are simply not able to provide for themselves. So it does become a global challenge, and I think it very much could be related to, in the future, much more than it is today, to conflict and wars in these regions.
How do we, I mean, have you not got the problem in the US? How do you get this across to the most of the people in the streets or the avenues that these are things that we, the mature world, have to deal with?
I'm very, very concerned about the isolationist trend here in the United States, which is probably best exemplified by Donald Trump, who said we simply build a wall. And I'm concerned about the isolationist trend more globally, because we do live in a global economy, and there's nothing going to change about that. We're not going to go back on that. And we cannot shut ourselves off from what happens in the rest of the world. If we want a better world, we have to work to make it a better world, and we can't simply hide within our borders and pretend that these problems will get better.
Deforestation. Forests are the lungs of the planet. They store carbon, attract rain, replenish groundwater, mitigate the effects of storms, very important, cool temperatures, create animal habitats, stabilize and nurture soils. Now, presumably, water scarcity, deforestation are directly linked.
They are linked. And what we see, for example, let me go to Brazil, a case of where the loss of the Amazon forest has contributed to increased drought in many parts of Brazil, so that now you have a major city, Sao Paulo, which is afflicted by drought, which many people believe is attributable to the changing forestry in Brazil, and that in turn is creating a major water scarcity crisis in Sao Paulo, as we're seeing in other major cities like Mexico City and other parts of the world. And then you mentioned in the case of Yemen a little while ago, the capital city Yana, where the hydrologists predict that the wells will go completely dry within the next 15 to 20 years. In fact, we're already seeing in the case of Yemen where water in many areas has to be trucked in because the wells have already started to go dry in many neighborhoods.
Well, in Europe, actually, Barcelona has a problem too, because if it doesn't snow in the mountains, there's a shortage of water in Catalonia. 57% of the world living in urban environments by 2050, maybe more, and it's obviously higher in the cities in Africa. Are we ready to deal with big urban environments with infrastructure, not just to prevent disease and water scarcity issues, but are we doing enough to prepare the urban environments for this massive increase in population?
An excellent question. Not only is Africa's population on a pace to double in the next 34 years or less, really, but what we're going to see is that about 80% of the projected population growth in Africa is going to occur in urban areas. And the reason for that is that the rural areas can no longer support the population. And so young men in particular have to find employment somewhere else. And in many cases they head, of course, for the major cities. And in other cases they head to other countries or head to Europe or head to other places in the world where there are better economic opportunities. And even at a 5% growth rate, you're seeing, in other words, cities that are going to double their population in the next 15 years or less. This is a tremendous challenge. And what we're seeing as a result of this unsustainable population growth in urban areas is the growth of large urban slums in cities all around the world.
I remember listening to a very good speech at the International Transport Forum meeting in Leipzig last year. We presented a paper there on sustainability. But this speech said clearly that New York actually was very well designed conceptually to expand and take account of a growing population.
And where you have a relatively slow population growth, oftentimes city planners can make the adjustments they need and do the good planning decisions and make the critical investments that are going to be required to accommodate a larger population. But when population in urban areas is growing at 5, 6, or 7% a year, it just overwhelms city planners. It simply is a challenge that no one can reasonably be expected to meet.
I was not familiar particularly with the term youth bulge. That comes out very strongly in your report. What is your comment on the sheer dramatic concerns that this youth bulge will cause?
When you have a large, disproportionately large number of young people in the population, particularly between the ages of about 15 and 24, and these young people are not able to get jobs, that this then becomes highly politically destabilizing because these young people are susceptible to being recruited in by terrorist groups or to joining protests against governments. So it can be a highly destabilizing factor. And right now in sub-Saharan Africa, about 43% of the population is under the age of 15.
Your report here says Yemen 42% and Somalia 48%.
48%. And these children are the young adults of tomorrow who will want jobs. And there is no very realistic prospect that the jobs will be there for them. And it's also true with respect to ISIS that ISIS basically has been able to grow so rapidly because it offers an attractive package in terms of young men who enlist in ISIS. At a time when unemployment is very high in countries like Syria and Iraq, but all around the developing world, the presence of a large youth bulge can be highly destabilizing.
Who publishes the Fragile States list?
The Fragile States Index is put together by an organization here in Washington called the Fund for Peace, but it's published every year by Foreign Policy Magazine here in the States. It's been published now for 16 years. This year is the 16th year, I believe, of the index. It originally was called the Failed States Index, and there were some concerns about calling countries failed states. So the term was changed to Fragile States, which I think actually is a better definition for what we're really looking at. We're looking here at countries that, because of various different challenges, including demographic pressures, are not really able to govern effectively. And in the absence of effective governance, these countries can become potentially failed states.
Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful chance to meet you and to hear your vision and experience and judgment. Really appreciate it very much. You and I will Skype another day ourselves.
Great. I hope you have a great conference in Vienna.